The first shovel of earth hit the coffin with a hollow thud, and in that instant, I thought my heart would break a second time. I had told myself this day would bring me closure, that watching the casket sink into the ground would help me accept that my husband was truly gone. The air was thick with the perfume of roses and the smell of damp earth. Mourners whispered prayers behind me, their voices blurring into a low hum that sounded almost like a song of sorrow. I leaned forward, my hand trembling, ready to press my palm against the cold, polished stone. That was when I felt it, a shadow brushing past me, the faintest rustle of cloth, and a whisper so low I wasn't sure at first if it was real. "He's not here." The words carved themselves into my mind like a blade. My fingers froze midair. I turned sharply, eyes scanning the crowd, but no one was looking at me. The priest continued his prayer. My son stood rigid at the edge of the grave, his face pale, but nothing seemed out of place. Not here. My chest tightened as my thoughts collided. What could that mean? Was the coffin empty? Had I been deceived? Or worse, was my husband still alive somewhere, watching me mourn a death that hadn't happened? I wanted to dismiss it as grief playing tricks on me. People see and hear strange things in mourning, don't they? But the tone of that voice was not a hallucination. It was low, urgent, almost desperate. It wasn't the kind of whisper that floats on the wind. It was deliberate, meant only for me. Fear rose in my throat, but so did something else, curiosity, sharp and unrelenting. My eyes darted across the cemetery, catching a glimpse of movement near the old oak tree. For a fraction of a second, I saw the outline of a figure, a coat collar pulled high, face hidden in the shadows. And then just as quickly, they were gone. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My husband had died in a car accident, sudden and brutal. I had seen his body, pale and lifeless. I had heard the doctor's words, final and merciless. I had stood in that sterile room and touched his cold hand. There was no way this could be a mistake. And yet, doubt sank its claws into me. What if I hadn't seen what I thought I saw? What if the truth was different, darker? The ceremony ended, but I barely remembered it. People hugged me, whispered condolences, pressed tissues into my hands. Their lips moved, but I couldn't hear the words. All I could hear was that whisper, over and over, echoing in my skull. He's not here. I clutched at my chest, feeling the hammering of my heart. I wanted to ask, wanted to scream at the crowd, did anyone else hear it? Did anyone see that man? But the shame held me back. What if I sounded insane? What if my grief was turning me into a woman who saw phantoms where none existed? That night, as I sat alone in the dim glow of a lamp, the silence pressed in on me. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps. My mind replayed the burial in an endless loop. I kept seeing the figure at the oak tree, and I kept hearing those words. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it had been some cruel trick of a stranger, a meaningless murmur in the wrong moment. But deep inside I knew. This wasn't random. This was a message, a warning, or maybe a confession. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to push the thought away. But questions clawed their way up regardless. Had I buried an empty coffin? Had my husband lived a life I never knew? Was there another family, another existence, hidden just beyond my sight? I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to cling to grief because grief was painful but familiar. Suspicion, on the other hand, was poisonous. It spread through every memory, tainting everything I thought I knew. And here's the truth I never wanted to admit. Not even to myself. A part of me wasn't just afraid. A part of me hoped that whisper was right. That my husband hadn't been taken from me. That he was alive somewhere, and that the nightmare of his death was only an illusion. But if that hope were true, it meant something far worse. That he had chosen to disappear, to abandon me, to let me grieve while he lived a secret life. And betrayal like that would have cut deeper than any grave. I lay awake until dawn, the whisper haunting me. I tried to convince myself I would let it go, that chasing shadows would only destroy what little strength I had left. But the next morning, when I looked into the mirror, I saw a different woman staring back. My eyes were no longer swollen with tears. They burned with suspicion. And I knew I couldn't let this rest, because if there was one thing I feared more than death, it was lies. And the man I buried might have been hiding more than I could ever imagine. And what happened when I tried to dig for the truth nearly buried me alive. Grief is supposed to make you feel empty. But what I felt after my husband's funeral wasn't emptiness. It was poison. His death should have broken me, yes, but it should have also reminded me of all the love we had built over decades together. Instead, that whisper, "He's not here," stalked every thought in my mind. I tried to push it away, but suddenly even my memories felt different, tainted, almost sinister. I remembered the boy I fell in love with in college. He wasn't the most handsome, not the richest, not the most charming, but he was steady. He had a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. Back then, we had nothing but dreams and cheap coffee. He would walk me back to my dorm every night, swearing he would make something of himself so I'd never have to worry. And I believed him. For years, I clung to that belief. Life tested us, though. Oh, how it tested us. We had nights when we counted pennies to pay the rent. We survived the shame of having our lights shut off, of borrowing from relatives who sneered behind our backs. I remember once, after our first son was born, I pawned my wedding ring just to buy formula. When I told him what I'd done, he cried. Not because of the money, but because he felt he had failed me. He worked 2 jobs after that. Long shifts, broken sleep, calloused hands. He used to come home so tired he'd collapse on the couch before he could even take off his boots. But I stayed by his side, always reminding myself, we are building something. This will matter one day. And we did build something. Slowly, painfully, but we did. A little house. A little family. Our son who we poured everything into. Every sacrifice we made was for him. School fees, sports clubs, even when he dropped out of one thing after another, we kept paying. When he wanted a lavish wedding, we emptied our savings to make it happen. When he fell into debt, we bailed him out. My husband would shake his head and say, we're spoiling him. But in the end, we both gave in. Because isn't that what parents do? They give until there's nothing left to give. But standing in the silence of that house after the funeral, I began to wonder, had all that giving been in vain? My son barely spoke to me. He avoided my eyes, his voice sharp, his visits short. When I called, he sounded impatient, like every word I spoke was an interruption. I told myself it was grief, that he was mourning in his own way. But deep down, I felt something colder, distance. A distance that had been growing long before the funeral, one I had ignored because it was too painful to face. And then there was my husband's side of things. The whisper had poisoned my trust, yes, but even before that, there had been shadows. Accounts I didn't have access to. Papers I wasn't allowed to touch. He always said he handled the big things, and I handled the home. I thought it was balance. I thought it was partnership, but now, it looked like secrecy. One evening, maybe a week after the burial, I forced myself into his study. I hadn't gone in there since he died. The smell of his cologne lingered faintly, mixed with the dust of unopened books and the stale air of a closed room. His desk was neat, too neat. My husband was never tidy. He left coffee rings and loose pens everywhere. But now everything was stacked, aligned, squared off as if someone had been here after him. My hands trembled as I opened the first drawer. Bills, old letters, scraps of notes. Normal things. My chest loosened a little. Maybe I really was imagining everything. But then at the bottom, tucked beneath a pile of bank statements, I found it. A receipt. Small, folded ones, yellowing at the edges. My breath caught. It wasn't for groceries. It wasn't for gas. It was a payment, large, too large for anything ordinary. The name written on it wasn't one I recognized. Not a company, not a friend. Just a name scrawled in ink. My stomach twisted as I read it again and again, the numbers blurring. Why would my husband be paying someone I had never heard of? And why would he hide it? I told myself to put it back, to stop digging. But the whisper burned in my head. He's not here. And in that moment, holding that slip of paper, I knew. This was only the beginning. The receipt burned in my hand like a secret I was never meant to see. I slipped it into my pocket, telling myself it was only so I could ask questions later. But in truth, I already knew I couldn't put it back. Once you open a door like that, you can't just close it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my husband's side of the bed cold and empty. I thought about the sacrifices we'd made, about the nights he claimed he was working late, about the times he brushed off my questions with that tired smile. Was all of it real? Or had I been living in some kind of carefully constructed lie? I told myself I'd talk to my son the next day. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he could explain what the payment was for. But when I tried to bring it up over lunch, his reaction was nothing like I expected. "Do you know a man named Richard Powell?" I asked gently, testing the waters. The fork froze halfway to his mouth. He blinked once, then set it down with a clatter. "Why are you asking me that?" His tone wasn't curious. It was defensive, sharp, almost panicked. I stumbled. I just found a receipt. With his name. Your father. Don't go digging through Dad's things." His voice was like a slap. Cold. Final. "He's gone." Let him rest. The way he said it made my stomach drop. There was no sadness in his tone. No warmth, just control. Almost like a warning. I tried to smile through the sting. "I just want to understand. That's all. It's important." But he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Drop it, Mom, for your own good." Those words haunted me long after he left. For my own good? Since when did my son speak to me like I was the child and he the parent? Since when did he know more about my husband's affairs than I did? That night, I cried quietly into the pillow. But grief wasn't the only thing spilling out of me. It was suspicion, shame, betrayal, because what if my son wasn't just being cold? What if he was hiding something? The days dragged on, and the silence in the house grew heavier. It wasn't the soft, respectful silence of mourning. It was thick, like a secret pressing against the walls. Every time I walked past my husband's study, I felt pulled back inside. And eventually, I gave in. I searched again, this time deeper. Beneath more stacks of paper, behind old envelopes. I don't even know what I was looking for. Proof, reassurance? A reason to quiet the storm in my chest? But the more I dug, the more it felt like my husband had lived a life parallel to mine, one I'd never been allowed to touch. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. A small locked drawer at the bottom of the desk. My hands shook as I tugged on it, but of course it didn't budge. I turned the study upside down looking for a key, rifling through books, shaking out jackets. Finally, inside an old cigar box, I found a tiny brass key tucked beneath loose change. The moment it clicked into the lock, my heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. Inside, there weren't stacks of money or jewels, things I half feared, half expected. There were more papers, letters, receipts, and at the very bottom, folded so neatly it almost looked deliberate, was another document. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. It wasn't just another payment slip. It was something else entirely. A legal document. A contract. And there it was, my husband's signature, clear and undeniable. But next to it, another name. A woman's name. I don't even remember dropping into the chair. But suddenly I was sitting, the paper trembling in my hands, my vision swimming. Another woman. Who was she? Why was her name tied to my husband's in something so official? For a long time, I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. I told myself it couldn't be what it looked like, that there had to be an explanation. But deep down, a voice I couldn't silence whispered, "This is it. This is the truth you've been afraid to find." I wanted to scream. I wanted to march to my son's house and demand answers. But something inside me held back. Because if I really asked, then the answers I got might destroy what little of my family was left. So instead, I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and sat there in the heavy silence of that study, knowing that my world was about to collapse. But what happened when I tried to uncover the rest of that truth? Nearly buried me alive. I carried that folded document around with me like a stone in my chest. At night, I tucked it beneath my pillow, as if keeping it close might keep me safe. But during the day, I couldn't stop looking at it, rereading the names over and over as though they might suddenly rearrange themselves into something harmless. But they never did. The woman's name, Caroline, was one I'd never heard before. Not a neighbor. Not a friend. Not even someone I could place from my husband's workplace. And yet, the way it was paired with his signature told me she wasn't a stranger. She was someone who had enough weight to leave her name behind in a locked drawer, hidden from me all these years. I thought back to the whispers of infidelity in our marriage. Years ago, there had been rumors. A phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear. Perfume on his shirt when he claimed he was at the office. He had sworn to me then, with tears in his eyes, that he had been faithful. That yes, he'd been tempted, but he'd never crossed that line. And I had chosen to believe him, because believing him was easier than imagining the alternative. But now, with Caroline's name staring back at me, I wasn't sure if I'd been a fool for forgiving him, or a fool for ever trusting him at all. One evening, I gathered the courage to ask my son about her. I didn't mention the document, just the name. "Do you know anyone named Caroline?" I asked casually, as though it had come up in a conversation with a neighbor. The way his eyes widened before he masked it with a laugh nearly shattered me. "Caroline? No, why? You making new friends, Mom?" He grinned, but it was too quick, too forced. I pushed, just a little. "I just came across the name. Thought maybe she was a friend of your father's." And then his smile disappeared. His jaw tightened. "Dad's gone. Why are you still digging into his life? Doesn't grief keep you busy enough?" It was cruel. The kind of jab that leaves a bruise on your heart. And I realized then with chilling clarity that he knew something. Maybe more than I did. That night I wept again, but this time the tears weren't only for my husband. They were for the son I no longer recognized. The boy I had raised with bedtime stories and scraped knees, who now looked at me as though I were an obstacle, not a mother. What would you do? If the child you loved more than life itself suddenly spoke to you like a stranger, would you blame grief? Or would you admit the unthinkable, that betrayal runs deeper than blood? But I didn't have time to linger on the pain, because the next morning, when I opened the mail, I found something that nearly made me drop the stack of envelopes onto the floor. A bill. Not for utilities, not for groceries, but for a property tax payment on a house I had never heard of under my husband's name. My pulse raced as I read the address. It wasn't ours. It wasn't anywhere near ours. It was in another town entirely. My husband had owned property I didn't even know existed. And with a sickening twist in my stomach, I realized Caroline's name could very well be tied to that house. The walls of my home suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. Everywhere I turned, there were ghosts of secrets I had never been invited to share. And though part of me wanted to burn it all, to stop looking, to go back to the bliss of not knowing, the stronger part, the part that had been awakened at his grave by that whisper, refused to turn away now, because deep down I already knew the truth. My husband had lived another life, and I wasn't sure if my son had simply known about it, or if he had been part of it all along. But what I found when I went to that hidden address made my knees nearly buckle beneath me. The house was small, painted in faded white with shutters that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't abandoned. The yard was trimmed, the curtains were drawn, and the faint glow of light spilled through the cracks at dusk. I stood across the street for nearly an hour, clutching my purse to my chest, convincing myself to walk away. To pretend I hadn't seen it. To go back home and tell myself it didn't matter. But then the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She wasn't young, not some 20-year-old fling. She was closer to my age, maybe a little younger, but her posture, her presence, it all screamed familiarity. She moved like someone who had walked that doorstep countless times. She moved like someone who belonged there. My heart thundered as I whispered her name under my breath. "Caroline." She paused as if she'd heard me, though the distance between us was too great. Her head turned slightly, scanning the street. And for a terrifying moment, her eyes seemed to lock on mine. I stumbled back, pressing into the shadow of a tree, my breath catching in my throat. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking. Long enough to know this wasn't just paranoia. Caroline wasn't some ghost from a distant past. She was real. She was here. And she was part of the life my husband had hidden from me. When I finally tore myself away, I drove home with hands trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing in circles. If Caroline was still around, what did that mean about my husband's death? About the whisper at his grave? And worse, if Caroline was part of this, was my son connected to her too? That night, I dreamed of coffins, empty coffins lowered into the ground while shadows stood at the edges, whispering secrets I could never quite hear. I woke drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around me like chains. I tried to confront my son again the next day. "Why didn't you tell me about the house?" I demanded. My voice shook, but I forced myself to stand tall. His face paled. For a moment, I thought he might actually confess. But instead, he snarled, "You've gone too far, Mom. Stop this, or you'll regret it. Regret it." From my own child. The words sliced me open. But even in my devastation, one thing became clear. My son wasn't just withholding the truth. He was protecting it. And the question that kept me awake at night was, protecting it from me or protecting himself? Because the truth is, once you find one crack in a foundation, you realize the whole house is unstable. And mine was about to collapse in ways I never could have imagined. I didn't eat for 2 days. Food tasted like ash in my mouth. I wandered from room to room, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the sacrifices I had made, the love I had given, the birthdays I had worked double shifts to pay for, the late nights I had stayed up mending clothes, clipping coupons, praying we'd make it through another month. And now, all of it felt cheap. Like I had poured my entire soul into a family that had built their own walls against me. But grief has a strange way of sharpening resolve. The more I replayed his warning, "You'll regret it," the more determined I became. If regret was coming either way, I would rather regret uncovering the truth than regret dying in ignorance. So I went back to the study one last time. And there, buried beneath piles of receipts and records, I found the document that finally broke me. Not another bill. Not another contract. But a birth certificate, and when I read the name written on it, alongside my husband's, I dropped the paper in shock. The paper shook in my hands. My eyes refused to believe what was written, but the words stared back at me, cruel and undeniable. A birth certificate. A name I knew, my husband's, etched clearly under the word father. But beside child, it wasn't the son I had raised. It was another boy, another life, another truth. And in that instant, the walls of my world collapsed. My throat went dry. I whispered to myself, no, this can't be real. Not after everything we've lived, not after everything we've survived. But the ink did not fade. The seal on the document mocked me with its authenticity. My entire marriage had been built on lies buried so deep I hadn't even thought to question them. I waited for my son to come home, clutching the paper like a weapon. When he finally walked through the door, his face heavy with that same distance he had worn for weeks, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I held up the document and shouted, "Explain this to me, now!" His eyes widened, his skin drained of color, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, terrified, cornered, defenseless. But then, just as quickly, anger lit his face. "You knew!" he screamed. "You knew all along, didn't you? You lied to me my whole life." The words pierced me like knives. I shook my head violently. "No, I didn't know anything. I only just found this. Your father? He hid it from me, from both of us." But he didn't believe me. He slammed his fist against the wall, the sound echoing like thunder in our fragile home. "Don't play innocent, Mom. You kept his secrets, you covered for him, and now you want to pretend you're the victim?" His voice cracked, half fury, half heartbreak. What would you do if your child, the child you carried, nurtured, bled for, looked you in the eye and called you a liar? My heart splintered under the weight of it. I wanted to hold him, to beg him to see the truth, but he recoiled from me as though my touch would burn him. Then the door creaked and my husband, my supposedly dead husband, stepped inside. His face was gray, haunted, but alive. My breath caught in my chest. And my son turned on him like a storm. "You ruined my life," he screamed at his father. "You made me live a lie." My husband's knees buckled under the weight of guilt. He dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I never wanted it to come to this," he whispered. "I thought I could protect you both. I thought I was doing the right thing." His excuses lit a fire in me. "The right thing?" I snapped. "To bury us in lies? To let me believe you were faithful? To let him grow up not knowing the truth?" My voice cracked into a sob. "You don't get to call this protection. This is betrayal. The house became a war zone." My son shouted until his voice broke, his accusations slicing through the air. My husband tried to defend himself, each word dripping with regret. And I stood in the middle, torn apart by two men I had loved more than life itself, realizing neither of them had ever given me the truth. That night, after the shouting dulled into silence and my son stormed out into the darkness, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the birth certificate before me. My tears blurred the words, but my rage burned them clear again. For decades, I had been a wife who sacrificed, a mother who endured. But in that moment, I decided I would no longer be a victim. If they had chosen secrets, then I would choose justice. The very next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Walking into that office felt like stepping into battle armor. The young man across the desk listened carefully as I laid out everything: the whisper at the funeral, the hidden receipts, the house with Caroline, the birth certificate, and the explosive fight at home. His pen scratched across the page as if trying to keep up with the avalanche of betrayal spilling from my lips. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "You need to protect yourself, legally, financially, emotionally. If what you've told me is true, then there are forged documents here, possible fraud and maybe even criminal actions. Do you have proof?" Proof. That word echoed like a bell in my mind. Until now, I had stumbled on secrets by accident. But from this day on, I would hunt them deliberately. I would gather everything. I started small, photographing receipts, making copies of every suspicious document I could find. But then I became bolder. I began recording conversations in the house, capturing the cracks in their stories. Every denial, every slip of the tongue, every half-truth, they became my arsenal. The first time I heard my husband's voice on tape saying, "She must never find out," my blood went cold. Hearing him conspire against me in his own voice was like being stabbed in the back all over again. And then one night I caught my son on the phone. He was speaking in low tones, but the words were clear enough. "Don't worry, Caroline. She won't be able to stop us. The money is ours." Ours. He wasn't just a pawn in this nightmare, he was a player. My stomach churned as the realization sank in. My son, the baby I had held in my arms, was plotting with the woman who had stolen my husband's loyalty. Betrayal ran in every vein of my home, and I was drowning in it. But instead of breaking me, it hardened me. The recordings, the receipts, the documents, they became my lifeline. I wasn't just a grieving widow or a broken mother anymore. I was a fighter, building my case brick by brick, determined to drag their lies into the light. What happened next would push me into a courtroom where every eye would be on me, waiting to see if I could prove the truth. And I swear to you, I had never been more ready. The lawyer's words haunted me as I left his office. Gather everything. Build a wall of evidence so strong they cannot deny it. It became my obsession. My grief transformed into fuel, my heartbreak into determination. Every drawer, every locked cabinet, every account statement became a battlefield. I began with the study, a place my husband had always guarded. His desk drawers were organized too neatly, as if he had arranged them for display. But at the back, taped under the wooden frame, I found another envelope. Inside were more receipts, payments to Caroline over years, not just months. Some marked as tuition, others as medical bills, and even one labeled emergency support. My hands trembled as I added them to my growing pile. How long had this other life been running parallel to mine? But that wasn't the worst part. Buried under those receipts was a bank statement I had never seen before. My husband had a secret account, with withdrawals that coincided perfectly with the times we were struggling. Times when I worked double shifts. Times when I pawned my jewelry to pay our mortgage. While I scraped and bled to keep our home alive, he was funneling money elsewhere. I remember sinking to the floor, clutching that paper and whispering, "You let me suffer while you saved her." My lawyer advised me to tread carefully, to act as if I knew nothing until the evidence was unshakable. So at home I smiled through clenched teeth. I served dinner, I washed dishes, I pretended to be the dutiful wife and mother. But behind closed doors, I became a spy in my own house. Every phone call I overheard made my skin crawl. One night, I recorded my husband saying, "She won't fight us. She's too weak." The venom in those words was enough to ignite my rage. Weak? After everything I had endured, he dared to call me weak? And my son, my beautiful boy, my pride, was no better. One evening, I stood outside his bedroom door and listened. His voice was hushed but firm. "We'll use the insurance money. Mom doesn't need to know. Once the estate is cleared, it's all ours." I nearly collapsed against the wall. The very people I had lived for were plotting to strip me of everything, to erase me from my own life. But what would you do if your own child conspired against you? Would you collapse under the weight of betrayal, or would you rise? I rose. With my lawyer's guidance, I began keeping a journal of every conversation, every suspicious action. I stored copies of recordings in secret places, one in the attic, one in a safety deposit box. If they tried to destroy the evidence, they would fail. The hardest part was facing them each day. My son still kissed my cheek in the morning, still called me Mom, but his eyes had changed. There was calculation there now, a coldness that chilled me to the bone. My husband, once the man who held me when I cried, now avoided my gaze altogether. He knew. He sensed I was onto him. One night, the tension boiled over. We were sitting in the living room, the TV buzzing in the background, when I asked casually, "Do either of you know a woman named Caroline?" The silence that followed was suffocating. My son shifted uncomfortably. My husband froze, his face pale as ash. I repeated the question, louder this time. "Who is Caroline?" My husband finally spoke, his voice cracking. She's nobody. Just an old friend who needed help." I laughed bitterly. "Nobody? Then why does nobody have thousands of dollars in her name? Why does nobody get money while I'm breaking my back to keep this family alive?" My son slammed his hand on the coffee table. "Stop digging, Mom," he shouted. "Just leave it alone. You'll only hurt yourself." His words confirmed everything. They were both in it, together. The fight that night shook the house. My husband begged, my son raged, and I stood there, my voice steady for the first time in years. "I'm done being blind. I will not be silenced. If you two think you can bury me in lies, you are gravely mistaken." I could see the fear flicker in my husband's eyes. The recognition that the woman he once deceived so easily was gone. From that moment, I knew the next battle would not be fought inside these walls. It would be fought in a courtroom under the unflinching eyes of a judge, and I would be ready. The day we stepped into the courthouse, I felt the weight of every betrayal pressing against my chest. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, the air heavy with the tension of battles waiting to be fought. My husband walked ahead, shoulders hunched, while my son walked beside him, his jaw set with defiance. They looked united, a team against me, but I was not alone. I had my lawyer, my folders of evidence, and the quiet fire burning inside me. For years, I had been silenced. Today, my voice would be heard. When the judge called the case, my son's lawyer spoke first. He painted me as unstable, grief-stricken, desperate to cling to money that wasn't mine. My son sat there, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the wronged child. My stomach twisted. How easily he lied, but then it was my turn. My lawyer handed me the folder and I stood. My knees shook, but my voice was steady. I began with the receipts, page after page of payments to Caroline. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as I laid them out, the dates and amounts impossible to ignore. Then came the recordings. The judge listened intently as my husband's voice echoed through the speakers. She must never find out. The words hung in the air like poison, but the final blow was yet to come. I pulled out the birth certificate and held it up. "This," I said, my voice trembling with emotion, "is proof that my husband lived a double life. Proof that my son was used as a pawn in a web of lies. Proof that everything I sacrificed was built on deception." My son leapt to his feet. "She's lying," he shouted, his face red with rage. "She's twisting everything." The judge silenced him with a stern glare. All eyes were on me now. I looked directly at my son and said softly, "I never lied to you. I only loved you. It was your father who betrayed us both." The room fell silent. The judge leaned back, his eyes heavy with thought. And then he said my name. When the judge spoke my name, the world seemed to stop breathing. My heart hammered so loudly I could barely hear his words at first. He acknowledged the mountain of evidence, the undeniable trail of deceit, the betrayal that had poisoned my family. But then he turned to me. "The question," he said, "is not whether betrayal occurred. It is whether you, standing here today, will allow it to destroy you, or whether you will rise above it." Tears blurred my vision. In that moment, I realized the courtroom was not just a place of judgment. It was a mirror, reflecting the strength I had discovered within myself. My husband buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. My son glared at me with a mix of anger and shame, torn between loyalty and resentment. For the first time, I saw him not as my betrayer, but as a boy lost in a maze of lies he never built. The judge set a date for final rulings, but it hardly mattered. The victory was already mine. I had spoken. I had fought. And I had proven the truth. As I left the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in my face. But I said only one thing. The truth always comes out. That night, I sat alone in my room, the weight of the battle finally settling on my shoulders. I wasn't free yet. There were still rulings, still scars that would never heal. But for the first time in decades, I could breathe, and I knew deep in my soul that the fight was far from over, because the next words the judge would speak would decide everything. The first thing I heard was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the shuffle of papers and the nervous coughs of strangers in the gallery. My lawyer's voice carried through the room as he placed the final piece of evidence on the judge's desk, a series of forged signatures that tied everything together. The betrayal was no longer hidden in whispers or shadows. It was written in black ink for the whole world to see. People gasped. Even the court reporter's hands paused above her machine as if she couldn't believe the lies unraveling in front of her. But the silence did not last. When my son rose to his feet, his chair screeching across the floor, the mask he had worn for months shattered before my eyes. His voice trembled at first, but quickly turned into a roar. "You lied to me. You're not even my real father." The words hung in the air like a dagger. The gallery erupted into murmurs, some people covering their mouths, others shaking their heads. My knees almost gave way beneath me. I had prepared myself for evidence, for cold documents and financial theft, but not for the earthquake of my own child declaring such a truth in front of strangers. I turned to my husband, desperate for denial, for any shred of reassurance that this nightmare wasn't real. But instead, I saw the color drain from his face, his hands trembling as he gripped the table. His lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time in our long marriage, he looked utterly powerless. And then, with the voice of a man condemned by his own conscience, he confessed. He admitted to the affair. He admitted to the years of deceit. And worst of all, he admitted that he had hidden this truth not just from our son, but from me. The weight of his words pressed against my chest so heavily I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand why. Why he had stolen my life. Why he had turned my son against me. Why he had built our family on lies. But I could not move. My voice was gone, trapped in the cage of my grief. Around us, people whispered, some in pity, some in judgment. The air smelled of fear and shame. Have you ever felt the ground disappear beneath you, as though the truth itself had pulled the floor away? That was the moment I realized I no longer knew the man I had loved for decades. And then, when the room was at its loudest, he raised his voice again, trembling but clear. "No matter what you believe about me," he said, "she is still your mother. And she still loves you." The words sliced through the chaos, cutting straight to my heart. For a moment, all eyes turned to me, as if waiting to see whether I would nod in agreement or turn away. My son looked at me with a mixture of rage and confusion, caught between the father who had betrayed him and the mother he had betrayed himself. I had never felt such a strange collision of hatred and love in one single glance. The judge slammed his gavel to restore order, but the energy in the room had already shifted. What had begun as a battle over property and inheritance had transformed into a public dissection of betrayal, identity, and blood. People leaned forward in their seats, some hungry for the spectacle, others heavy with empathy. My hands shook so violently that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. I could feel the judgment of strangers burning into my skin. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching a family unravel in real time. When it came time for the verdict, the silence was unbearable. My son sat rigid, jaw clenched, refusing to look at me. My husband stared down at his hands, the veins pulsing in his temples. And me. I closed my eyes and prayed that the truth, after so many years buried, would finally mean something. The judge's words were deliberate, measured, almost surgical in their precision. Justice was served. The lies, the fraud, the theft, each was condemned with the weight of the law. The gavel came down with a final strike that echoed through my bones. But justice in court does not heal the wounds at home. As the gallery dispersed, some strangers gave me sympathetic glances, others cold stares. My husband slumped in his chair like a man who had aged 20 years in a single hour. My son stormed out, his footsteps heavy with fury. I wanted to chase after him, to pull him into my arms and remind him that betrayal did not erase love. But I stayed seated, too drained to move, too broken to risk rejection. And then, when the noise faded and the papers were gathered, I sat alone in that hollow room. The battle was over, the evidence laid bare, the judgment delivered. But inside me, the scars throbbed. They would never vanish. Betrayal doesn't disappear with a gavel strike. It lingers in the quiet, in the silence after the storm. And in that silence, I realized something shocking. I was finally free from the lies. Free from the manipulation. Free from the endless weight of pretending everything was fine. But freedom does not come without a price. The price was my family, my trust, my very identity. And as I walked out of that courthouse into the blinding light of day, one thought burned inside me, more terrifying than any verdict. If the truth could set me free, then what would I do with that freedom? The first morning after the trial, I woke up to a silence that felt foreign. Not the heavy silence of secrets or unspoken rage, but a hollow emptiness, like the house itself was holding its breath. My son's absence was everywhere, in the unwashed coffee mug he used to leave on the counter, in the faint echo of his footsteps in the hallway, in the framed photos that now felt like cruel reminders of a love that had turned into betrayal. I hadn't lost him to death, but the grief that weighed on me was no less suffocating. Because how do you mourn a child who is still alive, but who has chosen greed over family? For weeks, I wandered through the house like a ghost. My husband tried to reach me, but every time I looked at him, I saw the man who had kept a devastating secret for decades. We shared a bed, but there was a canyon of silence between us, a chasm filled with years of lies and guilt. And yet, beneath all of that, there was something else, a strange flicker of survival. We were broken but not destroyed. I didn't know how to forgive him yet, but I also couldn't let myself wither away in bitterness. Somewhere deep inside, I still wanted to fight for life. It started small. I forced myself to step outside, to feel the air on my face, to remember that the world hadn't ended even if mine had. I began to write down my thoughts, pages filled with rage, grief, and shame. And one night, while staring at those words, I asked myself a question that shook me. What would you do if your own child tried to destroy you? That question became a mirror, forcing me to see my pain not as weakness, but as proof that I had survived something most people could never imagine. It was then that I began reaching out. At first, I didn't want to speak to anyone. The shame was too heavy. But eventually, I found a small group of women, mothers, wives, grandmothers, who carried scars of their own. Some had been betrayed by children, others by husbands. When I told my story, I expected judgment, maybe even pity. Instead, I saw nodding heads, eyes that filled with tears, hands that reached out to hold mine. And for the first time in months, I felt less alone. One woman whispered to me, "You are stronger than you think. If betrayal couldn't kill you, then nothing can." Those words wrapped around me like armor. Slowly, I began to rebuild. Not just my marriage, not just my sense of self, but my very definition of what it meant to live after betrayal. Because the truth is, we cannot control the children we raise. We cannot dictate their choices, their greed, their anger, but we can choose how we rise after they've broken us. My husband and I started talking again, not as the couple we once were, but as two flawed people learning how to breathe in the same space again. There were nights when I screamed at him, demanded answers, hurled questions he couldn't always answer. There were nights when he cried, when guilt poured out of him like a flood. But in those moments of rawness, we found something unexpected. Honesty. And honesty, though painful, was the first step toward rebuilding. It was not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness is too big, too clean a word for something so tangled. But it was survival. And survival was enough. As the seasons changed, so did I. I stopped defining myself by what I had lost and started defining myself by what I had endured. I began speaking to other women, telling them the truth that had cost me everything. I asked them the same question I had once asked myself. What would you do if the person you loved most betrayed you? Some cried. Some grew silent. But every time I saw strength flicker in their eyes, the same strength I had found in myself. I realized then that my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every woman who had poured her soul into her family, only to be left bleeding. It belonged to every mother who had given everything, only to discover her child's heart had turned cold. By sharing my pain, I was turning it into power, not just for me, but for them. And that's when I embraced a new truth. Betrayal may scar you, but it does not define you. Secrets may shatter your world, but they cannot erase your worth. Family may fail you, but you can still build a life that is yours alone. Because freedom, true freedom, is not about running from the past. It is about standing in the wreckage and saying, "This did not destroy me. I lost a son, at least for now. Maybe one day he will come back. Maybe he won't, but I cannot chain my life to his choices anymore." My husband and I are rebuilding, not into the people we once were, but into people who know the cost of silence, who know the weight of truth. And in some strange way, that brokenness has made us stronger. So here is what I finally learned after everything. Freedom is the greatest inheritance. Not money, not property, not even the family name. Freedom. The freedom to live without lies. The freedom to choose your own peace. The freedom to rise from betrayal and still walk forward. And that, more than anything else, is the gift I will leave behind.